Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session. So the whole idea behind the Sustaining EOSC session is it's linked to the advisory group of the same name, and we'll start with an introduction to the charters for the two task forces within this advisory group by representatives from the charter drafting coordination teams. And then we have a series of brief presentations from the open call that focus on funding models and long-term data preservation. We have a rather full agenda, so I kindly ask the speakers to please stay within their allotted time, otherwise I'll have to become Ming the Merciless and cut off your speech. And then we will finish with a brief panel with the speakers, for which we have a couple of prepared questions, but also encourage the questions from the audience. You can pose your questions at any time during this session in the chat, and I'll do my very best to monitor that chat and pose as many questions as time permits to the speakers. If you're using social media, don't forget the hashtag EOSC Symposium 2021 to promote this event. And without further ado, let me now hand over to the first charter presentation from Ornela De Giacomo from CERIC-ERIC about defining funding models for EOSC. Ornela.
Yes, hello, thank you, Bob, for the introduction. Next slide, please. I would like to start saying that the draft charter is the result of the work of almost 30 people, so there were many contributors. There were 4 coordinators and 2 liaisons with the EOSC Advisory Board. And we also kindly got from the EOSC Association all your comments while there was a consultation for the advisory groups and the task forces. So everything was taken in for drafting the charter. And you can find the full text in the link below. It's also in the chat. The next one, please. To put the task force into context, because the sustainability has many aspects. If we apply the OECD definition to the sustainability of EOSC, that would be the capacity of EOSC to remain operative, effective, and competitive over its expected lifetime. So you can see that this encompasses a whole set of topics. It's not only about funding, it's really a very wide, sustainability is a very wide topic, but many of these aspects were already addressed by previous work of the working groups, for example, in the Fair Lady report. Also, the previous advisory, the working groups in the EOSC, in the previous executive board, and many will still be addressed in the other advisory groups. And in particular, in the advisory group sustainability, we will just focus on the funding models. This is to understand that the scope of this task force is very limited, and this is the reason why you will see that the charter focuses only on this small part of the sustainability. The objective of the task force is to produce in 2 years, by 2023, a proposal for the long-term financial sustainability of the main building blocks of the EOSC. That would be the EOSC core, the exchange, and the federation of data and data services, these 3 blocks. And for this, we will, of course, build on what was done in the Fair Lady report. So we will also rely on their definitions. The next one, please. The main activities of the task force will be essentially to develop scenarios. And when we talk about scenarios, this was a little bit confusing for some people, but we expect that the different building blocks may have different models. So there will be not one model fitting everything, but there will be let's say a possibility of a round of different models that could apply. So we will build those scenarios, then validate their compatibility with national and European policies and legislation. So see if what is proposed can be applied. And then, of course, interact with the stakeholders, again, to validate these scenarios. The idea is that whatever is proposed by the end of the work of the task force has to be validated against policies and legislation and against the acceptance of the stakeholders. And another important point is to assess how these scenarios would impact in the value proposition. So we don't want to say to funders, just open your wallet. We want to say there is an exchange, we are providing value, and it makes sense that you provide funding because you have something in exchange. The duration is 2 years as anticipated, and the idea is to have the first set of models discussed in 1 year, so after next summer, and then by June 2023 or before the summer of 2023 to have already this validation, and in case some scenarios require to adapt some policies or legislation, there will be a set of recommendations on how to do that. And the next one, we would like to invite anyone who is interested in this topic and who thinks that can contribute to apply to join the task force. You can find in the charter the competencies we identified as useful to develop this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ornella. It was very clear and clarified the questions over timelines that we came up earlier in the week. So that's very good. I don't see any questions in the chat, so everyone else must have found it very clear as well. So let me now move on to Ingrid Dillo from Doorn, who's going to talk about the Charter for the long-term data preservation.
Thanks very much, Bob. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that what I'm going to present here is based on a group effort together with my colleagues Pirio-Lena Forsström, Chris de Loof, Ricardo Smareglia, and 12 other drafting volunteers. In the session yesterday, Bob already presented the overall outline of the Charter of the Task Force Long-Term Data Preservation that I'm going to talk about, but I will elaborate a little more and answer a few questions. So first one, why do we need this task force? The long-term preservation of the web of fair data that we are creating within EOSC is of course a crucial topic. We need to make sure that we not only make the data fair in EOSC, but that we also keep them fair over time. So the importance of long-term data preservation and stewardship has always been acknowledged in all kinds of EOSC-related policy documents, like for instance, the Turning Fair into Reality report, but also the recent SRIA of the EOSC. In that SRIA, it is stated that the EOSC will ensure long-term preservation and long-term availability of research data and tools. But despite this recognition, in practice, little progress has yet been made with the implementation of this really vital aspect of the EOSC. The topic of long-term data preservation was also not on the initial list of task forces, but I was very glad to see that during the consultation rounds with the EOSC Association membership, it was stressed that we needed to pay attention to this long-term aspect. And thanks to that, we now have this task force under the umbrella of the advisory group Sustaining EOSC. So what is the overall objective of the task force? As was stressed already, I think, in yesterday's session, the task force consists of volunteers, and its primary role is to provide advice to the EOSC board to feed into the SRIA, the next version, and hopefully also to influence the next Horizon Europe work program. Now, in the SRIA, further observations were made with respect to long-term data preservation. In the SRIA, it is said that long-term data archives and preservation services are required to enable a sustainable EOSC and the sustainable access to the data. And it also states that the roles and responsibilities for digital preservation are currently not clearly defined. And these findings are based on the report Fair Forever that was commissioned by the EOSC Sustainability Working Group. The aim of this task force is to provide in that context recommendations on the vision and on a sustainable implementation of long-term data preservation policies and practices. So what is this task force exactly going to do? We have defined different strands of work that can, as far as we see, largely be done in parallel. The first strand that we will start with is the creation of a shared understanding and vision because there is still a lot of misunderstanding and miscommunication about what long-term data preservation really entails. Different stakeholders use different definitions and language, and we need to solve that confusion first and create a shared vision of where we want to go. A second strand evolves around mapping and promotion of those roles, responsibilities, and accountability of the actors involved. And this also concerns identifying the stakeholders in the different stages of the research data lifecycle and their roles. And we also expect to produce recommendations for awareness raising and training in this context. A third strand deals with financial aspects of long-term data preservation, including the cost of digital preservation, financial responsibilities of the stakeholders, and also probably looking at possible business models for repositories. And there we can build on work of RDA and OECD. The final strand is about recommendations on the creation of a European network of trustworthy digital repositories that enable fair data. We will work on a roadmap to further mature the long-term preservation aspects of these repositories. And we also plan to provide recommendations for EOSC data services to connect to this network. And here we can build on work that is currently being done in the Fresh Fair project and other projects like EOS Nordic, work from EOSChub that is now continued in DICE. And then finally, a few words about how this task force will function. I noted that yesterday there was a lot of concern raised about the openness and the inclusiveness of the task forces. And what I'm going to say now is really my personal view, but I would very much like to follow in this task force the approach that was taken within the RDA with the COVID working group. I would like this task force to be completely open and maybe create different layers, one for people who really are willing and able to do real work and dedicate hours, but also maybe one for people who want to comment on draft, who want to be involved, but want to do that in a kind of lighter way. And next to that, I think we should build in periods for broader community consultation and review of draft outputs of the task force, and maybe also organize regular webinars to inform an even wider public on progress and direction of this work. And I think with that, I stop. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ingrid. We take on board the point you raise about the layers or roles of participation in the task force and addressing the questions that came yesterday. That's very good. I don't see any specific questions on the long-term data preservation task force in the chat, but I do see a discussion going on around the questions of costs. So I suggest we leave that, let that discussion carry on, and we'll come back to that perhaps at the towards the end of this session. Okay. So let us move. Thank you very much. So let us now move on to the presentations that came from the open call. We have grouped them first of all by what we classed as publicly funded service providers, and so we'd like to start with George Papastefanatos from the University of Athens. Yes. Sorry for abusing your family name there, and the work of on the EOSC portal by EOSC Enhanced project.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob. Yes, it's a long name. It's difficult sometimes to pronounce. I'm working in EOSC Enhanced. I'm part of the technical team, and for this talk with Carmela Acero, who is the project manager of EOSC Enhanced, we have prepared some slides with the work that we are doing in this project, and I think some of these aspects about the cost are also considered in our discussion here, and I hope that we open the discussion with this. Next slide, please. So the EOSC Enhanced is started in 2019. It lasts until this November of this year, and its main objective is to continue developing the EOSC portal, one of the main entry points in what we consider as EOSC and EOSC core, and more specifically to enhance the service provider interface, to incorporate new services and resources, to accelerate the deployment and uptake of EOSC services and resources, to increase user demand for EOSC services and resources via the portal, and to enable easier access to thematic clouds, to services and data through the EOSC portal. Next slide, please. When we started this work before EOSC Enhanced, there were different initiatives, different projects working in the development of EOSC portal. Infra Central, EOSChub, and OpenAir actually co-developed and we started working together and operating the EOSC portal. Now we have a single portal, a single catalog of services, and EOSC Enhanced is already cooperating and further developing EOSC portal along with a new project that started in April, EOSC Future. Next slide, please. So as of now, the main achievement has to do with, as I said before, the single portal, the single catalog of services, unified processes for collecting requirements, for change management, and also for, let's say, keeping metadata about resources, about providers, and other things that all these were achieved in the first year of our project. Next slide, please. And in the second year, we will continue in these lines of work. We plan to upgrade and provide a new version about the EOSC profiles and the APIs for the interoperability of the EOSC exchange with the EOSC portal. We plan to release new functionality for the end users, for the providers and the other stakeholders, and we plan to collaborate with the EOSC Future for improving and further develop EOSC portal. Next slide, please. So after this brief introduction, I will try to provide some work we are doing in our project regarding the EOSC portal sustainability. We are preparing a report by the end of this project with recommendations on technical development and implementation and funding for the long-term sustainability of the EOSC portal. In our review, there were high expectations expressed by the Commission and the reviewers for that, about how EOSC portal will be sustainable, and also recommendations were made about the EOSC portal sustainability with respect to the overall sustainability of the EOSC core. Next slide, please. So if we plan to discuss about EOSC portal sustainability, we should consider it as a part of the EOSC core services, the offering of EOSC core. The web portal is one of the entry point, let's say. It's not a single one, but one of the entry point that offers access to the catalog of resources, to the catalog of data, to content, to information about, in multiple format, about both the needs of supply and demand. So if we talk about the sustainability aspects, we should consider it as a part of EOSC core services. Next slide, please. So some open question has to do with the governance. What is the role of the EOSC Association in these aspects and the projects that are co-developing and cooperating the EOSC portal in strategic and operational decisions? Are we going to consider different business and revenues model for the different components in EOSC core, or are we considering a single, let's say, business and revenue model for all services in EOSC core? And what is expected from the EOSC portals in terms of interoperability with EOSC exchange and the development in this respect, with other thematic and horizontal projects, for instance, the COVID-19 portal, the CATRIS portal, which develops the catalog of research infrastructure, or the regional ones, the 5B project. So we must see all these questions regarding the sustainability with respect to these also very interesting aspects. So if we plan to consider these, what constitute the sustainability dimensions of EOSC portal, we should somehow try to make an in-depth reflection on the possible costs. We consider that the researchers are expected to be, let's say, to access services, let's say, free at the point of use, but this doesn't mean that there are significant costs to build, promote, maintain, and operate the services that are behind the EOSC portal. So we must first somehow try to answer the question, what are the real costs of the different components in EOSC portal, and who is going to pay for these costs, for what and how these costs are going to be covered. So this, next slide, please. Some studies, first of all, and also the reference document of EOSC sustainability. For instance, Vivu study estimated about 7 million to run the EOSC core, not the EOSC portal, the EOSC core, but some have already recognized that this estimate might be too low, consider the complexity of assessing this cost in EOSC. Also, the EOSC sustainability group highlighted that there are different costs between the operation and the development of new services. So when we try to assess the real cost, please, next slide, we should consider all the different dimensions, and also we should consider that there are different components, multiple components comprising the EOSC portal and different teams behind these components. We could see that there are costs for the development of new services, for the technical infrastructure behind these services for operation, for covering the operation costs. There are teams that are responsible for the delivery and operation of EOSC portal services. And of course, there are costs related to the onboarding of new providers, of new services, the engagement, the quality aspects, and finally, the harmonization of specification. This is a very important aspect that we have faced in EOSC Enhance, and I think it also holds for EOSC Future and all the other projects for harmonization of specifications with EOSC Exchange and how this could be, let's say, made for an interoperable EOSC. So all these costs should be broken down and somehow quantified in order to be able to discuss about covering these costs. Next slide. Some possible revenues model that have been considered in our project as well. First of all, for users. A free model, for instance, could be, let's say, offer discovery and access to resources for free, and can support access to all the catalog, not the use of the services, but the use of the EOSC portal catalog and marketplace and the service of EOSC portal for free. But again, does not answer the question who pays for the costs of these services. A subscription model could, let's say, offer paid subscription-based covering of costs for discovery and access to resources or access to specific portal services, but has the disadvantage of that is not suitable for widening the user base. A mix between these two models, a freemium model, let's say, can offer some functionalities for free and some others based on a subscription. And this also could be chosen. Some, let's say, premium service could be offered based on a subscription. Or another model could be, let's say, a pay-as-you-go, which requires some kind of paying or not free access for specific time or specific users, and some services can be, let's say, offered for free, and some others for under some based on the usage. And of course, this discussion could be open to other types or other schemes. Also, for provider, we should consider the incentives to attract providers to onboard, maintain, and update their offerings, and especially when it comes to commercial providers, how they can offer new business opportunities through the use of services by the EOSC portal. Next slide. Some key aspects and regarding the EOSC portal sustainability has to do with, let's say, 3 key elements. The first has to do with the quality. Users expect resources to be up to date and of good quality. The metadata of the resources, the services offered through the marketplace must be of good quality. So key aspects about the sustainability has to do with how we can ensure keeping a high level of quality of the service in EOSC portal and of the content in EOSC portal. For that, we need, let's say, to have a long-term dedicated small team which can, let's say, work as a portal operating center. There are, let's say, successful schemes in big infrastructure for that, which will work not only in the context of the projects, but also in a more long-term vision. And of course, we need to identify more clear the role and competence of the EOSC portal with regards to the EOSC Court and the EOSC Exchange, and this will help a lot on the sustainability aspects.
George, can you come to your concluding remarks?
Yes, this is the last slide, and I will try to briefly provide some recommendations. This will be also included in the final report. First of all, we need to define a core mission of the portal, whether we are going to provide support on serving institutional users or a wider pool of users. Second, we need to better understand that a project-based approach might not bring clear sustainability solutions. We need to have and set up a more, let's say, permanent core team dedicated to the EOSC portal operations. And this could be exploited and discussed in the context of EOSC association. We need to have professional level of SLAs and SLAs for serving the users. And this could help identifying fixed costs with stable instruments, not only based on projects, but also with more stable instruments for funding these, let's say, operational aspects. Some developments and new services could be funded by project-based approaches, by funding from the Horizon or other EU-funded projects, but we need to understand that more stable instruments should be brought forward. And of course, we need new business model. I think this will be discussed later on by next presentation. Thank you very much. I hope that we open some questions. This is our goal, and happy to answer next. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you, George. We're going already behind schedule. I've seen that your presentation has raised quite a lot of discussion, but no direct questions for you. So I think we can raise the questions around costing, and we can come to that to the end. And in the interest of time, I would like to move on to Peter Doorn from DONS, who's going to talk about long-term data preservation, archiving policies for EUDAT data services in the DICE project. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. You can all hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay. This presentation was prepared together with my colleague Ingrid Dillo from DANS and Mark van der Zande of SURF. Next, please. I want to tell something about this DICE project and the EUDAT collaborative data infrastructure, and especially why long-term preservation is a challenge, both for EUDAT and the EOSC in particular. And next we will go over to for which EUDAT services long-term preservation actually is a priority. Then I will say something about the EUDAT service management framework and long-term preservation policies, and finally end with how we envisage that they will be implemented for 2 of the EUDAT services, B2Share and B2Save. Next, please. So first of all, probably or perhaps you have heard of the EUDAT collaborative data infrastructure, or EUDAT CDI, which is one of the largest infrastructure of data services supporting research in Europe. It is sustained by a network of over 30 European research organizations data and computing centers, and developed in close collaboration with over 50 research communities spanning many disciplines and domains. And therefore, I think we can say that EUDAT really is a cornerstone of European data management infrastructure for the EOSC, providing facilities to store, find, access, and process data in a consistent and persistent way. Next, please. The DICE project, which stands for Data Infrastructure Capacity for the EOSC, has of course a number of general goals and envisaged impacts. I'm not going into the details here, but just want to say that the general aims are to provide state-of-the-art data services via the EOSC exchange, and to integrate data services with community platforms. Next one. Now focusing on what DICE aims to do with long-term preservation. And as such, you can see this as a kind of an attempt to implement, work out what my colleague Ingrid was already saying earlier in the session concerning the Charter for Long-Term Preservation. So DICE aims to provide the relevant EUDAT services with adequate long-term preservation policies and to implement these policies for at least 2 of the services, and I will return to those later on. And the idea is that these policies for long-term preservation will provide the core EOSC data services with a basic and fundamental solution and also associated business model to sustain research data in the long run, because obviously one of the problems of sustaining data in the long run is financial. Without such policies and cost recovery models, the future accessibility to and assessment of fair research data cannot be guaranteed. The next one. EUDAT CDI developed a framework of for service management in which the different roles, parties are described and who should, let us say, obey to which rules. Again, this is a simplified version of the overall framework, and I'm not going into any detail here, but it's obvious that we are dealing with end users, researchers, with customers, usually service providers, who are also part of the EUDAT CDI, and there is also the EUDAT limited company. And those rules that are described, they have to do with the service level or the operational level agreements that are needed, but also for the users, it is necessary to know which acceptable use policies they have to abide with, and what can be guaranteed with respect, for instance, to privacy of data sets that they may have, how that will be treated. Next one. And if we look at long-term preservation policies, that's actually zooming into the previous overall set of agreements. There we have a couple of, let us say, rather more specific kinds of agreements that will be necessary. So EUDAT is going to provide a long-term preservation policy, which we will make available as a template so that it can also be used outside of the EUDAT CDI. And there will be, based on those policies, an archiving service agreement, because not all the service providers operating within EUDAT will be able to provide the long-term preservation of data sets themselves, and may use for that dedicated and certified archives. And of course, one of the questions, but this still has to be decided, is whether we should offer end users or researchers a possibility to opt out of long-term preservation if they don't want that. Next one. Now, the EUDAT services in themselves are already a whole bunch, and they are categorized in this slide in a number of categories. And you see the middle 3, data archives, policy-based data archives, and data repositories. And it was interesting that Ingrid before me was already saying that it is actually quite important that we agree also on definitions. What do we mean by those terms like repository, archive, and policy-based data archive? And I've done an attempt here to describe what we mean by that, where a data archive is usually concerned with the long-term preservation of the bits. Policy-based data archives adds to that the curation or the management of fair data, and the data repository usually in itself doesn't say something about whether the data will be preserved for eternity or not. It can also be preserved for a midterm, for instance. But there are also lots of data services that do not require long-term preservation. I'm not going into those here, but it's useful to note that that is the case. Next one. Now, two of the core EUDAT services that we are working on is B2Share and B2Save, where B2Share, very briefly, you could say, is actually characterized by a lot of relatively small data sets, the long tail of data, whereas B2Save has more to do with the bit preservation of very large data sets, often in the tera and petabyte scale. Next one. So we are currently working on formulating those policies and on archiving agreements with dedicated archives. We are aiming for a relatively brief policy referring to what is existing elsewhere in terms of FAIR principles or core trust seal for the certification of repositories that provide long-term preservation policies, long-term preservation of data. The adoption of a long-term preservation policy will be optional for data service providers. They will not be obliged to do so. It will depend also on what they intend to offer. Next, we will have a model archiving agreement of service providers with dedicated and certified data archives, including costs for B2Share, and to implement those for B2Share in at least one case of CSC, which runs the core B2Share service, and to have that archived at DANS. And what still has to be decided is what to do with researchers that would like to opt out of long-term preservation. Next one, and final one, is a more general further outlook. I already said that the policy template and model archiving agreement will be available for other data service providers and trustworthy digital repositories that want to offer long-term preservation as a service. It's good to know that we already have now about 100 core trust seal certified trustworthy digital repositories in Europe, and that they should evolve and are evolving gradually into a network of FAIR enabling archives covering all regions and disciplines. The continuity of the nodes in such an archival network is our guarantee for the survival of FAIR data in the long run. That data will not only be FAIR now, but also in the future. And I should say that DICE is, next to formulating those policies and agreements, is also developing the technical solutions for connecting the EUDAT data services to trustworthy digital repositories. And also these solutions will be made available for the future network of trustworthy digital repositories as part of the EOSC. And I hope that my short talk demonstrated that the EOSC Charter is not just words, but that work is in progress to get elements of this charter worked out in reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. You highlighted the EUDAT developed this framework of agreements for service delivery, and that B2Share services are being put in place with archiving at CSC and DANS. But But if I understand that policies that will come out of those services will be available to other service providers, not just the ones from the B2 whatever series.
Exactly. It is the policy should be, let us say, relatively straightforward and also short, and focus on the principles. And those should be applicable in many cases, at least. I don't dare to say yet all cases, but in many cases. And the same holds true for the archiving agreement. If an organization wants to use an external archive, then we will have like a model agreement that you could use if you want to make use of an external provider that guarantees the long-term preservation for you.
Yeah, so what this raises that's being discussed in the chat is that some sort of policies would imply redirecting national funding over borders to other service providers. And questions about whether or not such a change in policy is foreseeable in the near future.
Of course, this depends a bit on what the funding model is going to look like. The project only started a couple of months ago, so we're not yet finished with everything. But I foresee that, let us say, the cost of the preservation of long tail data will not be that expensive. Probably only when you cross a certain quantity, volume, it becomes financially difficult. With the preservation of the data from B2 safe, it may be different. But whether it is wise to move that data at all is, of course, a question. I foresee that actually there it is more about providing guarantees on spot than to move those data to another provider or to another country.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter, for those insights. Let's move on now to Science Mesh, making a federated infrastructure of sync and share services sustainable. And this will be presented by Ron Trompert from SURF and the CS3 Mesh for EOSC project. Ron, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. First of all, I want to apologize for the name. We came up with a name for our project, which closely resembles as a very secure password. But I can guarantee you we're good at a lot of things, but not at inventing names, probably. Next slide, please. Well, the CS3 Mesh for EOSC project started in January last year. It's a 3-year project running until the end of 2022. It interconnects already existing storage and research services scattered throughout Europe and also in Australia, by the way. Uninett is also one of the partners in the project. In total, we have 13 partners within the project, and it's led by CERN. It's all about creating an innovative, collaborative mesh of application services, and I come to a little bit more detail later on. Also, it's all about supporting open source software and also let's say, provide the possibilities to make data fair. And of course, we also cherish the open data principles. The core foundation of the project and the whole infrastructure that we're going to build is very decentralized by nature, with a very lightweight, centralized component of that. And this way we want to provide one of the building blocks to build the European Open Science Cloud. Below there is some links if you want to know more information about this. Next slide, please. Well, this whole project is built upon what we call EFSS systems, that is Enterprise File Sync and Share Systems. So think about the Nextcloud, OwnCloud, PyDO, C-File, and the like. This whole community, that's called CS3, that stands for the Cloud Services for Synchronization and Sharing. It came to be around 2014 when, let's say, the on-premise, the idea of having on-premise sync and share solutions, so think like clones of the Dropbox and the OneDrives and things like that, came to be to run these services, let's say, on-premise. And now the community steadily grew. As I've noticed that this virtual background behind me came from a Nextcloud server run by the EOSChub. So, well, we are all familiar with using those kinds of services. And in this project, research labs, NRANs, universities, companies are collaborating. All in all, this community consists of 130 organizations and about more than 30 service nodes and well over 25 countries. Well, the map that you see on the right-hand side is a bit outdated because well, also Latin America and Africa are represented in this community. Altogether, we have something like well over 400,000 users, store more than 16 petabytes of data, and we have about 3.5 billion objects. Yeah, well, the users that we serve, it's yeah, big science. I mean, CERN, for example, is a very major player in this field. Also, educational institutes, and also the long tail users, let's say the users that are, let's say, using a sync and share service in one university or want to collaborate with the group in another university, probably in another country. And those are people want to share data together and the like. So this is what it's all about. And next slide, please. Yeah, what we let's say what we came to realize is that all of us were just developing our services, and everybody was reinventing the same wheel everywhere. So we decided to collaborate on the development, the future development of our services, and that's why we have submitted the proposal for this project to the EU. Let's say let's say how we came to be, our whole existence may be a little bit different from other e-infrastructures. We were already a set of established services that want to collaborate and form an e-infrastructure. So first there was the services, and then there is the e-infrastructure, which is not quite how it usually goes with other e-infrastructures. But well, the core of the whole science mesh, as we call it, is formed by the existing services located at sites that have full, let's say, sovereignty, so they're their own boss. And the fabric is going to be very lightweight, and I will explain it, how that works later on. Yeah, and that is what we are going to bring to the EOSC, let's say, that the users that can stay where they already are, but using this federated infrastructure, it will make it easier for them to collaborate with colleagues abroad. And of course, yeah, our rules of participation are very lightweight, and it's for an institute to, let's say, join our science mesh infrastructure is, let's say, it's not going to be a very costly or troublesome thing. Next slide, please. Well, and that is exactly the infrastructure that's going to build. We're going to build. This is our logo. Next slide, please. Sorry. Yeah, what we're currently doing is there is an interoperability layer that is developed, and this interoperability layer allows us to, let's say, using sync and share services to, let's say, not only federatively share data with each other, but also applications. And with that, you can think of Jupyter notebooks to do interactive data analysis. Collaborative editing is also a major part of that, and very much so also open data. So to let our sync and share services interact with let's say, archival or data publishing solutions. That's also covered by one of the tasks in our project. And last but not least is also the data transfers, because for some use cases, like we have, for instance, in the Netherlands for LOFAR, the data locality for processing is important. But we're also working on mechanisms to transfer data from sync and share services to other places. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is a very, let's say, a simple picture of our architecture. How everything technically works, I will refer to the presentation by my colleague Hugo Gonzalez Labrador from CERN, who's going to give a presentation in a breakout session this afternoon. That's about cross-cutting interoperability challenges. He's going to give a presentation on the technical insights and outsides of our project. What we have is a set of services running at different places that are already sustainable by local funding. And yeah, just joined together in an effort to further development of their services. There's a very lightweight central component of that, and that includes a help desk, which is only for site admins. There is monitoring to monitoring the quality of the services, usage metrics gathering, and also a topology database to see whose website is member of the mesh. Next slide, please. Yeah, what makes the sites, if all the sites are independent, what makes the science mesh? Well, first of all, we are bound together with policies and procedures. Recently, we finished a deliverable for the EU, in where we describe all our operational procedures, also admission regulations, the governance of the science mesh, and all things like that are described in that. Also protocols, and that's also something that Hugo is going to touch this afternoon. There's the CS3 APIs, which allows applications to interact with this interoperability layer. And of course, in between sync and share services, there's the open cloud mesh standard that CS3 has now adopted and taken over from GÉANT for the EFSS interaction. Next slide, please. Yeah, so yeah, the local costs that are incurred locally are already covered. So in that case, we do not have a problem. And we try to, let's say, to fund the federative aspects of our e-infrastructure by, let's say, let's say, secure funding for that by at least minimizing the cost as much as we can. So therefore, everything will be very lightweight. So it's easier to ask for very little money. The chances that you get it are a lot, look a lot better than when you don't. And yeah, of course, a number of the sites are funded through local funding sources. And of course, every site can, let's say, argue with its funding source to let's say, okay, being part of this federative infrastructure is a very good thing for our users, so maybe we should spend a little on it. Other things that we can think of are membership fees or whatever. So this is the way we think we can do it. Next slide, please.
Ron, you have to wrap up as soon as you can.
This is my very last slide. Perfect. So here is, I'd like to conclude with a few links to more information if you're interested. And well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ron. So if we summarize, you've highlighted that Science Mesh is a well-established global community making use of sync and share services. You highlight as well that the technologies and policies that links independent sites that are already sustainable with their own funding.
Yes.
And that seems to be a lot of the question around the discussions that are going on in the chat. It would raise one question for me. What happens if you have users at a site which don't have the capacity or the technical abilities to provide on-site sync and share services? How would they gain access to such a science mesh?
Well, there are two mechanisms for that. A lot of these sync and share services are also allow guest usage. So let's say if you do not have access to such a service yourself, but you're collaborating with someone who has, then you can are able to get a guest account. That's for one. Another thing is, and that's also an option that we need to investigate, is to find a partner who will be able to give those kinds of users access. So that means that a lot of, let's say, national organizations are by regulation bound that they're also, let's say that they can only deliver the services to a certain group, defined group of people. But if somebody is completely outside of everything, then for those users we need to find a partner, I think, who is able to provide such a services to anyone.
Thank you very much. So in the interests of time, I think we have to move on now. That concludes our rapid tour of some of the publicly funded service providers. Let's look now at some of the initiatives that are making use of commercial service providers. And we'll start with the long-term digital preservation services for the European Document Science Cloud, the Archiver solution from Arkivum, and that'll be presented by Matthew Addis. Please, Matthew, over to you.
Thank you, and good morning to everybody. So I'm going to talk about some of the work that's been done by Arkivum in the Archiver project in the area of potential new services for long-term digital preservation for EOSC. Next slide, please. I mean, firstly, it's good to see awareness of the role that long-term digital preservation has to play in ensuring research data remains findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable for long-term. That's already been covered in this session, so I won't go into detail here. I will just briefly highlight the Fair Forever report from the Digital Preservation Coalition. That's a really good place to start on some of the pressing next steps. Next slide. I'm not going to repeat why long-term digital preservation is important and how it can help fair data to remain fair. What I will talk about is some of the practical issues around ensuring that long-term digital preservation services are themselves sustainable. So I'm sure people appreciate long-term digital preservation is an ongoing series of activities. It's actions you take over time to ensure that digital content remains accessible and usable. And otherwise, there's a risk that data is no longer fair because over time, it's become lost, unusable, or can't be trusted. And there's loads of standards and good practice from the long-term digital preservation community that say what should be done, but applying that good practice requires ongoing resources, which includes the need for funding, and it requires persistent infrastructure and services, and not least significant ICT infrastructure to store, process, and provide access to digital content in the long term. And someone needs to build the infrastructure and services, and someone needs to operate it, and someone needs to pay for it, and it needs to be sustainable. Next slide. So when considering long-term digital preservation infrastructure and services, I think there are several things to consider. Firstly, services need to scale and be able to cope with data volumes and types seen in EOSC, all the way from the long tail of science through to big institutions and research collaborations. And when I say data, I actually mean data, metadata, methods, software. I mean, they're all important. Secondly, services need to be cost-effective and affordable. And that means low long-term total cost of ownership. And that total cost of ownership needs to align with real-world budgets and what institutions and funding bodies will pay. So data archiving and preservation is a remarkably cost-sensitive area. Budgets are tight, and that's despite the value that the data has if you make it accessible in the long term. And then thirdly, and no one's really talked about this so far, long-term digital preservation services need to minimize their environmental impact. And given the ICT requirements and all the activities involved, that's got challenges. So the best place to store and provide access to research data in the long term to minimize, for example, carbon footprint and make services environmentally sustainable isn't necessarily where the data is first created or where the data will subsequently be used. Next slide. So we're addressing these challenges through our work in the Archiver project. So Archiver is a European Union supported project that's looking to advance the state of the art in digital preservation for large scale scientific data sets in EOSC. So Archiver uses a pre-procurement model to co-fund contractors, and Arkivum is one to do R&D into new approaches to long-term digital preservation. And that's largely around the technical problems of large-scale, long-term, cost-effective preservation of big scientific data sets. We're in the prototype phase of the project, so we're building new solutions and services. Next slide. So our approach in Archiver is to provide data preservation and archiving services that can implement different workflows for different domains. So astronomy, particle physics, genomics, and so on are use cases in Archiver. Everything is automated and scalable, and everything is driven and made available through APIs. So the service can be embedded into a wider, fair landscape. And I think that the point about APIs is quite important. We use open specifications, open standards, and in some cases open source. So we can plug these services into a wider environment. So they could be used by a network of trusted digital repositories, for example. I'm digressing a bit. Next slide. The important thing really is that these preservation services are designed to implement the requirements of OAS, TDR, Core Trust Seal, DPC RAM, and a whole load of other standards of good practice for archiving and preservation. So data flows into the services from the left through archiving and preservation services we provide in the middle, and then out to people who need to use that data at some time in the future. Next slide. In terms of implementation, it's all about microservices and Kubernetes, and just using the specific services that are needed for a particular organization or type of data. We use a serverless computing model, and we can deploy on AWS or Google or on-prem. In Archiver, our primary deployment platform is Google, but we're portable. So, for example, we're deploying on-premise at the DESI synchrotron in Germany, who are one of the Archiver end users. The main point really is that this whole serverless approach, wherever it gets deployed, is really designed to be scalable and cost effective. So you only pay for resources when they are actually being consumed. And that's really important to keep the costs low and make the solution or services economically sustainable. But it also helps minimize environmental impact because it minimizes the need for ICT equipment, power and cooling. Next slide. I mean, our results so far in Archiver are promising. Tests have done so far by Archiver end users, being able to ingest, process and store up to 100 terabytes of data a day through these services. I'm not going to go into detail, but the system sort of spins up, allocates resources, processes data through all the steps shown on the left, and then spins down again, so costs aren't incurred if there's nothing to be done. Next slide. I mean, there's still lots of work to be done in Archiver. We're currently in the prototype stage. And it doesn't address all aspects of sustainable long-term digital preservation in EOSC either. I mean, there's so many other challenges to resolve, especially around policies, funding streams, procurement models, deployment models, how EOSC engages the private sector and commercial providers of services. There's EUDAT and DICE. There's other long-term digital preservation initiatives, such as the CF Digital E-Archiving Building Block. And there's a question about how all of these things work together. For example, whether we use the EUDAT sort of model agreements. And I'm sure the EOSC Preservation Task Force will pick that up. But I think in terms of technical approaches to long-term digital preservation services that are scalable, efficient, follow good practice, are both economically affordable and environmentally sustainable, then I think Archiver as a project is making some really good progress. Next slide. So I've gone through that really quickly, and I'm sort of conscious that we need to get back on track with time, but I'm hoping that's given you a brief insight into what Arkivum is doing in Archiver and some of the sustainable services we hope to be able to offer EOSC in the future.
Thank you very much, Matthew. You're a chairman's best friend. A very clear message and within time. And we have a question for you. So how does Archivum deal with the very important aspect of data governance, not only in Germany? data that cannot leave some set boundaries while maintaining scale advantages?
Yeah, so data sovereignty is an issue. So because we can deploy both on-premise, we can put our solution into a private environment in a particular geography, and that's what we're doing for DAISY. But we also deploy onto Google. So they have data centers across Europe as well as internationally. So we can spin up instances of this solution in different geographies to meet data sovereignty requirements. I think some of the challenges in that are that, you know, whilst data sovereignty is important, where you locate that data in the long term needs to be about who's long term going to use that data and other issues around things like environmental sustainability. So there are some tensions there to resolve as well.
Okay, well, I take away the message of saying that you can deploy on site or in commercial cloud services,
yep.
And that is the choice of the user in effect.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. If we move now on to Jan Meijer from Uninett and João, who's going to talk about the sustainability reflections on pan-European funding routing to commercial services in EOSC. Jan, take it away.
Thanks, Bob. So good afternoon. I'm Meijer. I work for the Norwegian NREN Uninett, and as such, we're quite used to delivering infrastructure services to millions of people through our collaboration in GÉANT and routing things. So I figured reflections on funding routing would be appropriate. So next slide, please. So background of the OCRE project is the notion that research can benefit from using commercial services for a variety of reasons: capability, capacity, agility, instant availability, increased productivity, things like that. There's also the notion that commercial cloud services are basically the same regardless where in Europe you buy them. And then the notion that the EU procurement directive enables for cross-border demand aggregation and shared procurement since the 2016 update. That then leads to the notion, thank you, that it makes sense to establish a common portfolio of commercial services in EOSC and make that available easily to ultimately the consuming researcher. So that's what OCRE set out to do, establish exactly that on two different service types: commercial infrastructure cloud and commercial Earth observation, then stimulate the adoption of those services by a €9 million adoption fund. And OCRE is very much an exploratory project. So we also have the mission to develop the capability for procuring and brokering commercial services in EOSC. So we experiment quite a bit. Next, please. Short note on free at the point of use. So we're exploring how do you provide free at the point of use access to commercial services. Free at the point of use does not imply free of charge. There is a bill to be paid, and especially with commercial services, that's an operational expense that is a continuous thing that you need to pay. It's not something you do like a one-off every 4 years. Next, please. So what we're exploring is the notion that you have a voucher, you have earmarked funding that's issued by some funding agency. That can be used by research projects to pay for services in that EOS portfolio of procured commercial services. That is then a subset of the total amount of available commercial digital services. And OCRE is slotted in there as kind of like a translation service, if you wish, between money and something that you can hand over to a researcher, a kind of virtualization of money, if you wish. Next, please. So we're investigating how to deploy free at the point of use at scale for using it in commercial services. We've done a pan-European procurement for infrastructure as a service providers, 40 countries. We've used GÉANT as the central purchasing body. We've used GÉANT's links with the 40 NRENs, so the long-term links with the 40 NRENs, to make those agreements available to thousands of institutions. Click, please. That led to about 10 platforms per country with a nice mix of US and EU providers. Click, please. That resulted in 1,250 bids, 475 contracts, which now are available through those thousands of institutions to approximately 1 million researchers in the public domain. And I'm mentioning these numbers because there's the scalability aspect, and that is what makes this difficult. Next, please. So on the topic of funding routing, so we're experimenting with that €9 million funding fund that we have available, and we've currently conducted 2 experiments: small value vouchers to individual researchers and higher value projects with institutions. Click, please. And we have about 21 of those in a number of different countries. And all is well and good, but if you then want to actually contract the services, make them available to these individual projects in all those different countries, then there are a couple of problems that will hit you. Click. And that is that the combination of cross-border VAT plus vouchers, which are governed by the EU Voucher Directive, plus EC grant eligibility, apparently requires a person with a PhD in all of the above to resolve the issues that you have. And I shan't go into the details of the issues. If you're interested in that, contact us and we'll happily provide you with a 2-hour in-depth workshop. But these are quite serious issues that immediately hit you as you're trying to do this at scale for the entire EOSC community. Click, please. And in addition, you should realize that the EOSC user community, it's not governed by the same legal system. So there's a chunk EU. Switzerland, for example, is not part of the EU, not part of the EEA. Norway is part of the EEA, which makes it easier. Moldova is neither. And the EOSC community comprises of essentially the Horizon Europe community, which encompasses quite a bit of different legal background. Next, please. So I promised some reflections, so a couple of reflections. So if you want to do these things at scale, the devil is in the boring details. This is quite easy to get done on a smaller scale, but as you're trying to design something that can actually scale to the millions of users, thousands of institutions, 10,000s of projects, then you're going to hit cross-border VAT compliance, procurement compliant purchases, how to deal with supplier liability where it needs to be dealt with, and you're going to have to deal with funding eligibility. As mentioned, the EOSC user base is not governed by a single legal framework, and even where it is within the EU, like cross-border VAT, it turns out that this is surprisingly not uniformly implemented across Europe. So there's quite a bit of complications. The concept of EOSC service vouchers seems to be a promising concept for providing free at the point of use access to commercial services, provided you can solve the above, and we have good reasons to believe that we can solve the above. Having said that, life would be a lot easier if there wouldn't be VAT due on services purchased with EOSC service vouchers. So if a policy change can actually make that happen, which will not happen overnight, but it might happen in due time, that would make things a lot easier. And you could ask yourself the question, well, maybe you can actually remove the middleman and get earmarked funding directly from the funding sources. That would make the process for the researcher probably quite a bit smoother. Next, please. So OCRE is an exploratory project, so we're going to continue exploring for the remainder of the project's lifetime, the next year. We're going to do something with vouchers to individuals, and we're going to look at bigger projects, possibly through aggregators. In EOSC Future, we're going to build on OCRE and investigate additional cloud service delivery routes and funding delivery mechanisms to and through service aggregators like science clusters, ERICs, research infrastructures, etc. Thank you for your attention, and I think I managed to gain you 1.5 minutes.
Oh, thank you very much, Jan. So according to Carmelo Cero's suggestion, I think EOSC Enhanced should be paying you and Matthew a few euros each, according to what's in there each for finishing early. You highlighted that there's free at the point of use does not mean free of cost, and that comes from the Fair Lady report. That's the thing we all have to remember. And then you've noted the number of cross-border procurement issues where compliance, especially given the EOSC footprint beyond just member states, means you have to deal with different legislation. Okay, so that's all very, very good input, as you say, for the task force and for the EOSC Future project. So there's no direct questions, and so if we can, I'd move on to the next presentation by CloudBank by João Fernandes.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Yeah, so my name is João. I'm a member of CERN IT. And probably you have my name associated to other projects today on the next 10 minutes, I hope. I'll talk about CloudBank. Okay, so next slide, please. So what is CloudBank? So essentially, CloudBank is a project that started in the US, led by University of California, San Diego, and supported by the NSF. The idea was to develop a set of services that could manage access to public commercial cloud by the US research community. Okay? So since we had some of the same problems to solve, and I'm going to touch them, CERN has started to experiment CloudBank in the US with a deployment of about 15 use cases, machine learning, HPC, database, and quantum computing. Most of them because we didn't have yet the infrastructure and the services needed on-prem, either in terms of scale or in terms of type, for example, when you talk about quantum computing. In the meantime, the EC has funded UCSD and CERN to experiment CloudBank in Europe. Why? Because it's a model that can provide structured access to multiple clouds, and I'm going to go a bit more in detail on that. And at the same time, to improve it in Europe or to implement it in Europe, we need, there are several questions that need to be addressed. And I think Jan already touched some of them, that are not only technical, but also in terms of financial aspects, financial liabilities, and everything that relates to data processing under GDPR, for example. And so the last objective of this experiment is to prepare this expansion of the model to research organizations in Europe and to cloud providers also in Europe. In the meantime, we have signed an MOU between CERN and CSD that will make this possible to extend and to co-develop this set of open source services. Next slide, please. So if I go to the scheme, is a bit of overwhelming scheme there because there are lots of pictures and lots of relationships. I'll try to simplify this. What is happening here is that research, not here, in the US, what is happening is that research and institutions are making solicitations, research solicitations, research projects that will make use of cloud funds, okay? And then the NSF awards partially the funds to the research and partially the funds to use cloud to support that research. And that's where CloudBank comes in. So CloudBank will not interfere on anything in terms of technical models or how the deployments are done. It will only track the cloud funds that have been awarded by NSF for a given project. On the other side of the equation, you have what you see there are the 5 hyperscalers that are supported by CloudBank in US. And that usage reporting is back to CloudBank. So you can imagine a research team that is using for different models or for different reasons, 3 or 4 different cloud providers, and then it tracks the consumption of the NSF fund on these 3 or 4 cloud providers. In specific in US, we have Strategic Blue that is doing all the payments and dealing with all the management of payment to cloud providers. Next slide, please. So what is NSF trying to solve? I mean, for NSF, I think is a problem that we also have here. We need an entity that facilitates and tracks the use of cloud. It's not enough to have a procurement exercise and then contracts. What happens next? You need to track the funds that are allocated to researchers to the clouds, and then you need to track actually what is the billing that is going on there. For researchers, the important thing about this is that we let them focus on research and not on all the management aspects of access and of billing that they don't want to spend so much time on. And at the same time, and I'll expand a bit on that, we educate them to use cloud because most of them yet don't have enough skills to use cloud and in a very cost-effective way. And of course, for cloud vendors, this is also very good because you structure the research sector as a new growing market, understanding where are the needs and understanding what services are used. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide out a bit scrambled. So where do we see the relationships with EOSC and GaiaX? So we think the model of CloudBank can be a model that is flexible and is flexible enough to scale for different types of contracts and for different types of relationships and funding. I'll go a bit on that as well. We do have an open source suite that we are developing some projects, and Matthew talked about our activities in Archiver. We also have activities in OCRE that are testing the cloud providers and specifically testing European cloud providers where we are deploying and working examples of different research workloads, and this can be brought as well as a compliance mechanism. And then we can also have this CloudBank model as a complementary model of what is happening in OCRE, for example, where contracts are being established under the EC framework. Could be another framework, but under the EC framework, because it's flexible enough to bring these contracts and do all the tracking and monitoring that happens once the contract is allocated. Next slide, please. So just to give you a hint about the compliance and validation tests that the teams are doing. So we are essentially testing every single cloud that exists in Europe and probably in the US. With a set of different research workloads and research sets that are being validated against all these clouds. Next, please. So what is happening now? Just to give you back, coming back to the first slide that you saw, where I talked about the NSF CloudBank instance. So we have a set of workloads, 15 workloads from different research teams. So you can imagine, not imagine because it's happening, but the accelerator team is using, for example, AWS Bracket to understand the quantum services of AWS. And you have another team in another experiment that is using machine learning in, for example, Google, or DB as a service in Oracle Cloud. So all this information is being gathered in terms of usage, and CloudBank is keeping track of the differences of usage in terms of billing from one to the other. We are using CERN SSO via EUDAT. The procurement funds that we allocated were from CERN, because we are piloting this with CERN procurement funds. And there we have Strategic Blue in the middle doing the contract work, because it was the easiest way to start the process this year, and subcontracting these clouds that I mentioned in the other slide. The animations are getting a bit scrambled. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is going to happen now? So we are going to install, thanks to the CERN USD co-development MOU, we are installing a CloudBank instance in Europe, and it will do essentially the same thing. So scientific proposals from CERN that make use of services, IS, PAS, and SAS. We are not going to make any difference there. They need only to be compatible with the services that are offered by the cloud providers. We'll have a CloudBank instance that will, in Europe, that will allocate from one side the funds that are being tracked for each of these research teams in different departments, in different research units, completely separate, completely independent. And on the other side, we are developing a usage billing and reporting system in CloudBank.eu, where we're going to have the billing aggregated across different teams for all the providers that you see there. So apart from AWS and Google that we started with, we have also Oracle being joined, and some GaiaX providers that already expressed interest in joining the initiative as well. Can you click, please? Yeah. So, and what can you imagine here? So we also have already some because of the flexibility of the model and this bring your own contract concept. We have other IGOs interested in experimenting CloudBank in Europe. Okay, and we could imagine that this model could expand and be scalable to EC funding, to national funders, because essentially CloudBank is not interfering on the contract chain in any sort. It's just monitoring the funds that are allocated independently of who is the funding body, and the funds that are being spent by the researchers themselves. Okay. Another aspect that we are exploring is this, I call it clearinghouse services. Why? Because as Jan already mentioned, there are several issues that need to be taken into account. Financial liabilities, for example, VAT management across countries, SLAs that can be accepted between cloud providers and research performing organizations. And then we have everything that relates to technical and acquisition measures for data exchanges based on EU, and also any cost optimization for the workloads that are being deployed in the cloud providers themselves. Can you click, please? So what we aim to achieve here is this virtuous cycle that you see in the middle. So if we manage to optimize spending at the contractual level, we then can invest that spending in tutorials and training, and we are doing this already in the scope of CloudBank now. We have 2 or 3 tutorials already in the different services, machine learning, quantum computing, and HPC. And then this is going to lead to a better choice of resources by the researchers themselves, and then these spending optimizations will improve. So we think this is a sustainable cycle for use cloud, commercial cloud by European researchers. Next slide, please. So the model is being expanded beyond CERN. So at CERN, we have the instance that are going to probably become production by H2 2022. We are setting up a testing instance for this next gen. We are going to bring all these steps to expand to other European organizations. So the bring your contract model that I talked about before, the cloud providers that are involved, is it a direct relationship? Is it via reseller? What is the federated authentication scheme that is in place? So this is what we are going to do with a number of organizations that expressed already interest. Developing the open source cost tracking and prediction dashboard that I mentioned before, and then the extension to other European providers. As I mentioned, there are at least 2 GaiaX providers that already expressed interest. And I'm going to summarize, please. Next slide. So to come back to the beginning, so CloudBank.eu is assessing a scalable model of bring your own contract. I already repeated this several times. That, I mean, doesn't make any kind of discrimination if the contracts are national, international, EC, or IGOs. Replying to the questions that you see there, because most of the users still don't understand how they can use well commercial cloud providers. Providing transparent billing and tracking across and data processing terms. A managed structure to a scattered collection of projects. And I think in Europe, there are a scattered collection of projects in different countries using cloud. At CERN, we had them as well. And now we are structuring them via CloudBank. An important comment, this is not a competitor. It is not to allow competition between commercial and public, but more to complement. And I gave 2 or 3 examples of infrastructure and services that are not yet available in on-prem. So the word here is not competition, but more complementation. We'll build the necessary set of skills for these users or these researchers to use these modern cloud services effectively with all this cost effectiveness and optimization. And we think this will be strategic to define the appropriate model to access commercial cloud for research. And I'm done. I hope I'm still on time.
You owe us €2. So there's been a lot of discussion about the clearinghouse concept in the chat, but that seems to be resolved on your slides. There is still one pending question. Does CloudBank rely on having a CERN single sign-on identity?
No. Right now, CloudBank is using the CI logon, the proxy service in the US. The idea is to integrate as many as we can federated authentication schemes in Europe, because we know they are different depending on the research community or on the organization that is in CERN. So no, it doesn't depend on SSO.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So with that, because we're short on time, we're going to change direction a little bit now. We're going to talk more about the business models and looking beyond what's being provided by the different projects and the different services. So I'd like to ask Sergio and Dale to talk about the EOSCHub project results on business models and sustainability.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dale Robertson from Jisc, and together with Sergio Andreozzi from EGI, we're very pleased to have the opportunity to present the results of the EOSCHub project in the area of business models and sustainability. Next slide, please. So the EOSCHub project was primarily a technical project. Actually, it ran from January 2018 until March of this year. It had 9 key exploitable results, but one of those was focused on business and sustainability models, and that's the work that we're going to present just now. Next slide, please. So a few quick general words. So this work in essence was concerned with analysing and adapting business and sustainability models for resources in the EOSC, and it was looking at the EOSC as a shared innovation ecosystem. So we started by proposing a description of the structure and contents of the EOSC, but that's not what really we're going to focus on today in these slides. We built on that then by performing an analysis of challenges in cross-border service provision, which was because it was clear that with the EOSC, it can be expected that there would be increased use of services across borders within, for example, multidisciplinary projects. And so it was important to drill further into some of the issues that are involved in that area, which we did. Then there were proposed procurement and business models, or recommended or assessed procurement and business models for acquiring services in the EOSC, and we also presented recommendations and a roadmap for future work around sustainability. The context, of course, is that there's this expectation that EOSC services should be free at the point of use, but as has already been pointed out, they're very much not free to actually provide. I think it's always been understood that multiple business models were going to be required with different funding streams and many, many different types of services. The member states have an important influence over the business model and funding decisions. And of course, all of this work was being conducted against a rapidly evolving wider landscape. Next slide, please. So in terms of the governance and sustainability work, the final deliverable in this area was D2.5, which contains the full details, of course. We actually proposed 21 recommendations in total. Not all of those are even actually on these slides, and there isn't time anyway to go through them in any detail. So this is really just very much to give you a very brief introduction to the work. And I'd refer you to the deliverable for the full details. The recommendations, we have 5 areas or 5 different objectives. The first of those was the need for greater efficiency in the allocation of EC and member state funding for e-infrastructures. So the recommendations, for example, included one that said there should be greater alignment between research strategy and e-infrastructure strategy, both within member states and at the European level. The second objective was about the need to fund the expected additional marginal costs of consumption of resources arising in the EOSC, because that does refer to the cross-border use of resources specifically. So one of the recommendations there was the need to really very clearly articulate the EOSC value proposition, especially to funders. The third objective is the need for there to be due consideration of the wider and longer term consequences of the choice of suppliers for the EOSC core. And there we recommended that there should be a study into the pros and cons of the use of publicly funded versus commercial providers, and looking at a number of different aspects, really drilling into some of the details there and thinking around what happens with the use of procurement. Next slide, please. The fourth objective was about the need to identify and understand the consequences of the use of public procurement. Again, looking at the wider and longer term consequences. Here, one of the recommendations was about the fact that currently many publicly funded e-infrastructure providers don't participate in public tenders, and the recommendation there was that that should be reconsidered and reevaluated, in fact. And then fifth and finally, but certainly not least important, is the area of research support provision. We actually felt that this was very important. The objective here was the need to assess the cost, the likely demand and take up, and what the funding sources could be for research support provision, which we recommended is likely to need to be unbundled so that you really expose the full costs of that type of activity. And for example, that when you're specifying tenders, you should include research support services in the provision, in the specification of the tender. So I'm going to hand over now to Sergio to go through the procurement and business models side of things.
Thank you, Dale. I'm continuing the presentation, focusing more on another stream of activities that happened in the EOSChub project that is documented in the deliverable 12.3. And in the whole work of this stream of work, what we did was mainly we started by doing market research to understand what services were delivered to research, under which conditions, which funding streams, and so on. And then we did a case study driven analysis, starting from real scenarios, and we tried to understand what are the underpinning business models and what are those relevant for the EOSC. When we identified those business models, also we tried to understand what are the key principles behind these business models. And we thought about this was important because those principles then can be used also to think about maybe alternative new business models. And what you can see here in this slide is like 6 principles that are not all embedded in one single business model. Maybe one business model will embed 1, 2, or 3 of them. And quickly, okay, the first one is about focusing on creating competition and having the best suppliers to emerge based on some quality criteria. The second one is more about simplifying the administrative cost and participation of suppliers, so making it easier to acquire services. Third one is more achieving economy of scale through demand aggregation. The number 4 is more about opening up existing research infrastructures. And here you can think about the virtual access mechanism from the Horizon Europe program as an approach. And then we have the approach to join funding from different parties to achieve a common interest. And then another one could be that aim of the principle could be to facilitate public-to-public cooperation with cost reimbursement. Next slide, please. In this slide, you can see an overview of the 8 high-level business models we have identified at the end of the project. And the first 3 are connected to the Public Procurement Directive and also its financial rules. So it's basically when a public institution needs to buy services, and then it would do this in compliance with those regulations. And so you have 3 of them. One could be doing public tender and sign a direct contract. Second could be developing a framework agreement without a central purchasing body. And third could be to do a demand aggregation and having a central purchasing body. Some of this can be combined, also like in the numbers 2 and 3, like in the OCRE case. The business model number 4 is the one that is more connected to grants, and which the focus is more about opening up research, like existing research infrastructures. So that's the virtual access approach. The 5 and 6 is more around joining forces, funding, for instance, funding resources nationally and then delivering in-kind contributions into a joint pool. This can be combined also with some parties, maybe they can bring money. So you have the 2 flavors here, either pure in-kind or in-kind and in cash. And the last 2 business models falls more into the thinking of how can we facilitate public-to-public institutions cooperation in delivering services and achieving also cost recovery. There are 2 schemes here. One is more the what we call horizontal, when the parties participate jointly in the service delivery. And then we have the vertical, when a certain set of public organizations create another entity to deliver services and to the club, let's say. And those business models use a specific exemption from the directive. Next slide, please. In the slide, you can see you can find the reference to the main work. On the left-hand side, you find the links to the deliverables that are available online. And on the right-hand side, you find links to on-demand webinars. You can just click them and you will receive you can register and you will have a, say, more concise access to the information. Next slide. And here you can see the partners that collaborate in Work Package 12 in the Task Studio 3. We also collaborated with the 3 consultants and the support of from Astron, EMBL, and CHESNET from some use cases. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio and Dale. Very helpful overview as the business models and the recommendations that come out of a very large and cornerstone project contributing towards EOSC. So as you say, I think those documents, reports will be very useful for the work of the task forces going forward. No direct questions in the chat. So our last speaker of the day is Michela, who's going to talk about OntoCommons and put it in the context of EOSC. Michela, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. Bob has mentioned I will be talking about OntoCommons. I'm the Innovation and Sustainability Manager for this project, but I'm also chair of the Industry Foundation, which authored the study for the expansion of EOSCs to broader stakeholder communities, and the 2 are rather related. If we could go to the next slide, please. So OntoCommons is a CSA. It's a rather large one. It has very many partners. It basically has several RTOs, even multiple offices of the same RTOs. It has who's who in the material science and industrial ontologies. It has gathered a great deal of momentum. It focuses on interoperability with also several industrial demonstrators, 11 to begin with, and further ones offered, even from places like Japan, Korea, China, and Brazil, and a stellar advisory board, which includes the chief advisors in the US. So it is very much not only a European, but also a global initiative. But what is really notable about it is that it is leveraging the work from EOSC and from several FAIR-related projects. It very much focuses on FAIR data. And also it's harmonizing ontology-driven data documentation with the focus particularly on cross-domain interoperability, because it is the first in the industry commons calls. And the project actually scored 15, so it really did build momentum. So it has already links with EOSC, and it is able to create a unique bridge between industrial partners and EOSC. If we go to the next slide. So there are several synergies that we can identify between EOSC and OntoCommons. One particular is data valorization that's provided by EOSC infrastructures, particularly in the standardization integration of data documentation. Data valorization is, of course, incredibly important for our industry partners. And we have to remember that when we talk about industry partners, we're talking about industrial researchers, primarily, who are part of this project, and several of those are already active in EOSC. So there isn't a great gulf between EOSC and industry in that sense. There is actually a very nice bridge there that we could exploit. Particularly in the sense that all of this data, it has to be fair, it's built according to FAIR principles. The EOSC valorization then increases the demand for verification amongst our industrial partners. So actually verification is important, as important for researchers as it is for industrial partners. OntoCommons, on the other hand, can actually support EOSC governance structures with recommendations on metadata, particularly with existing and emerging metadata schemas and tools that are available. And also, of course, providing a set of agreed ontologies. And the ontology ecosystem that is being built is going from the top level reference ontology to application level through mid-level and domain level ontologies. So the set of tools for data documentation are particularly currently focused on the NMBP domains. So nanomaterials, advanced nanotechnology, advanced materials, biotech, and advanced manufacturing and processes. And of course, all of those domains also would apply then for the same domains in research as they would in industrial research. Next slide, please. So as we currently have 11 initial demonstrators from the likes of Airbus, Bosch, Siemens, Eibel, etc. And they really highlight the cross-domain interoperability value that is the same for industry as it is for a cross-domain interoperability in research, across research domains. So one of the really important bits of feedback that we have received, and this was through our study, was that EOSC verification actually can be used to valorize commercial industrial FAIR data. And this is a very important point to note for EOSC sustainability, for setting up potential valorization verification for industrial partners. The other really good collaboration opportunity is between the OntoCommons road mapping and standardization activities, which can help populate the next version of the CERIA, particularly the chapter on metadata and ontologies. And one thing that we would really strongly encourage is for the S3 science clusters, and some of those are actually working with ontologies, as we have seen, and certainly those are working with FAIR data, to actually participate in the OntoCommons workshops and showcase their work so that we can actually align the work between the two sides. We already have some of the RDA community present in the project as partners, but obviously there's greater work being done within the RDA, and so we would also encourage more presence from the RDA. And then next slide. So this is just zooming out a little bit to look at the landscape of EU data marketplaces. One of the things that is very clear already from the previous presentations is the strong synergy between Gaia-X and EOSC. But actually, if we look at EOSC landscape, the verification is a very strong USP for EOSC, which should really apply to all of the other marketplaces. Now, these are just, this is not a non-exhaustive list of what is out there, but all of those are relevant. And each one of those, if examined through from the point of view of their USP, can actually complement each other. So the verification from EOSC is something that can be offered as a service to all of the other marketplaces in Europe. And this would also contribute to a potential strategy for sustainability. So this is it from me for now. I hope I wasn't going on for too long. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Michela. Very helpful overview of the idea that OntoCommons is building a bridge between industry partners and EOSC to increase data valorization. You talked about EOSC can valorize industrial fair data, but there is one question. Can you explain what data valorization actually means?
So from the industrial perspective, I can explain this from the perspective of outside in. So quite a lot of the presentations today have been from inside, looking from inside out. So the way that this looks from the outside, and this is obviously through having conducted huge amount of interviews with stakeholders on this topic, is that when it comes to commercial use of data and selling data or licensing data between commercial entities, there is currently no certification, and it's currently very difficult to assign value to data. And as we all know, obviously, even the metadata descriptions of data sets are not properly standardized. And even when we have good metadata, we don't really know of the quality of data, etc. So verification of data, many commercial entities see this as a first step in the valorization process for commercial data. And this is a very interesting discovery for us, because that means that EOSC provides potentially an absolutely key service for commercial data applications, which can provide a revenue stream that's very clear from our perspective. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks very much indeed. We are running 15-20 minutes late, but if the speakers agree, I think we could at least do a quick version of the panel. So I would request those speakers who are still with us, who don't have to leave immediately, if you could please turn on your cameras. And what I will do is that I will pose the first question, and if there's a speaker, if you want to make a comment, just raise your hand so I can see you on the screen. So the first of the prepared questions that we have for this is, what other funding sources than EC grants do you foresee to contribute to the sustainability of the services that have been described? So I say, raise your hand if you have any idea how to answer that question. So Michela, you're the first one.
Well, I will just continue on the same train of thought. I mean, I think I've just presented a possibility where actually there is a service to be had to outside stakeholders, some of whom are already connected to EOSC. But certainly, if this becomes the standard, there is a very clear revenue stream that can come from industry stakeholders who actually desperately need at this stage in the proceedings to have a certification of their data.
Very much. Anyone else want to add something on this point?
Yeah, if I may, Bob.
Sure,
yeah, so for me, sustainability and diverse sources of funding are quite, are embedded on the word. To be very specific on the example that we gave with CloudBank, that's exactly one of the aspects to bring in, is to bring your contract model that you might have in research for different research organizations. Whether the funding or contractual frameworks are different, they can come from the EC, the NSF, from IGOs, from the university itself. CloudBank proposes a model to track and to manage all this.
Okay, thanks very much. Anyone else? No? Okay. In that case, sorry, Sergio, I can see. I just saw your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add that. So we just to reinforce a message was given before. But in the EOSC, we have mixed ecosystems where there are public organizations, also private organizations willing to participate. And of course, we need a variety of funding streams that are compatible also with the boundaries conditions of those organizations. Definitely for the services that need long-term commitment availability, it's important to combine these grants with the member states funding, which probably will be the biggest part, and also to combine them with a kind of evaluation of quality of the service delivery, so that anyway, even though there's a long-term commitment, but anyway, there's a regular evaluation on the quality delivered.
Okay. Anyone else want to? Other speakers want to say something here? No.
Yes, I'll just say a very quick word, Bob. So I've seen there's been lots of messages in the chat. I don't think I've managed to read all of them, but I've seen quite a few of the comments. And I'm afraid for me, I find it difficult to see that the member states can avoid having to make some form of commitment to the kind of wider, bigger, broader European cause, really. Excuse me. I don't know exactly in what form they're going to be able to do that, but I think ultimately, whilst respecting sustainability, I think to support increased cross-border activity, there probably is going to need to be some form of agreement of supporting that and thinking more widely, sort of committing to the overall bigger European cause and beyond just national interests.
Right, thank you. Ornella.
Yeah, just to summarize, because there has been a lot of discussion on this on the chat, and I think at this point it is clear that there will be multiple funds, multiple sources of funds, and the task force will have then the difficult task to see how to combine them. It is clear that there needs to be a combination, that projects are not stable funding, long-term commitments. They can be focused, they can serve some objectives, or they can aggregate some communities to work together, but for sure that's not sustainable. And the final, let's say, configuration will be for sure a combination of all. Also, subscribed services from users directly, from researchers.
Okay, great, thank you. Anyone else to ask something? No? Okay, then let's move on to the second question that we've prepared. What are the key elements of the EOSC exchange? It was mentioned earlier in the session by George, the EOSC exchange or marketplace, that would make it attractive over the long term. George, you want to start?
Yes, I'll try to be brief. So I think there are a lot of elements. I'll point here the aspects of interoperability. If we talk about the EOSC exchange as a whole and how communities can actually communicate, thematic communities can actually communicate and bring forward collaboration, cross-community collaboration. So in terms of what we are discussing here in EOSC, I think interoperability and openness across all EOSC exchange efforts is crucial and is a key element in order to build added value services that break the boundaries and offer new opportunities to different communities. This is, I think, a key point. Okay.
Anyone else? So Dale?
Yeah, so I'll maybe just take the opportunity to say a word about what we call the shared resources, since there wasn't really time during our presentation earlier. I think an important point is the need to make available services like cloud and compute services within the EOSC exchange, which can basically, in a sense, if you like, support the increased use of cross-border, the increased activity across borders of research. I think that's quite an important element. And of course, that's the whole point, that you need to have a funding model to try to make those available and figure out how to do it. But I think in terms of the attractiveness of the EOSC as a whole, those services are very important within the EOSC exchange.
Okay. Yes, as you say, in the absence of the funding model, which Ornella has said is one of the key functions of the task force, and there's certainly a lot of material come up on the very active chat today around that subject, and it's definitely worth preserving this and taking into account. Would anyone else like to add something here? Sergio? You're muted still, Sergio. Okay.
So for service providers, I believe it's important to keep the a low administrative overhead in participating in the exchange, and also providing an integration toolkit so that it will be easy for them to integrate with their core services. And then it's important also for public institutions that they're also able to demonstrate research impact through the participation and to recover the full cost of the participation. Otherwise, the risk is that they will stay set with the national boundaries, as was mentioned before. And for private providers, it's important also for them, okay, it will be a commercial activity, so for sure they will need to generate a profit, or maybe they can participate because they can participate in complex use cases where it can drive and achieve innovations. So there could be two types of drivers. On the user side, I would say availability of having integrated services and data, so having platforms where they can do analytics and storing data and also using data. To receive support, as I mentioned, that also just services without support, expert support, may not be so attractive, they may get lost. Support can be also in the both consulting, but also in guiding what is the best service for them. And then to have a transparency of the service conditions and understanding also the reputation of the providers. Sorry. Thanks.
Ornella.
Yes, I very much agree. Actually, I think that it would be successful if we knew that there is an added value in every service we find in the EOSC exchange. So if it would somehow guarantee that whatever is there has an added value for the community, also the user friendliness for everyone, for the researchers, for the providers. So clear rules and clear use. I think this aspect is sometimes underestimated, and if we expect everyone to go through a training of 4 hours to understand how to find a service, that would make it difficult. So also, yeah, make a service that would be intuitive on how to find things and make the use ease for everyone. I would invest a lot in that and in marketing. We tend to underestimate and think that because things are good, everybody will know them and will use them. That's not always the case.
Yes, and we saw some very good examples in the chat today of organizations actually involved in projects and they didn't even know they were involved. That's quite, the question of marketing is very good there. Okay, so in the interest of everybody's lunchtime, I will draw this panel and this session to a close. First of all, I'd like to thank you all on behalf of the EOSC Association and the Programme Committee for participating in today's very packed agenda. Thank you, you've made it very with your interventions. Also, thank you very much to the audience for sticking with us and a very active dialogue on the chat service, which I think will be useful for the task forces going forward. Great. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.